I thought this morning I would tell you some of how my philosophy of integrative medicine developed, about my philosophy of nutrition, and also talk to you about what I see as the importance of health coaching in the future of healthcare. First of all, let me say, it should be no secret that healthcare in America is in desperate shape. We have not had a healthcare system in this country. We have a disease management system that's functioning very imperfectly, getting worse by the day. There's no fix for it. And most of the diseases that we're trying to manage are diseases of lifestyle that could have been avoided if people made better choices earlier in life about how to eat, how to handle stress, how to exercise, and so forth. And I think we really have to ask ourselves as a society why we don't do a better job at promoting health and preventing illness. And I think, unfortunately, that has a very simple answer: they don't pay. And until we can figure out how to make prevention and health promotion pay, we're not going to get anywhere. I'm often asked at what point in my career did I convert to this way of thinking. I never converted. I've always thought this way. I never practiced conventional medicine. I have a lifelong interest in plants, something I got from my mother that she got from her mother. That led me to be a botany major as an undergraduate at Harvard in the 1960s. That was a very unusual choice of major in those days. You know, botany was a very unfashionable field. But I had the good fortune to fall under the mentorship of a man named Richard Evans Schultes, who was the director of the Harvard Botanical Museum and is considered now the godfather of modern ethnobotany. And under his leadership, I developed a career interest in medicinal plants, and that's been invaluable to me. And I can't tell you the satisfaction that has come from learning and using in my own life and being able to recommend to patients plant remedies that are safe and effective. I'll just give you one example. We're coming into allergy season in many parts of the country. I grew up in Philadelphia with a bad ragweed allergy. And it was a real toss-up whether I suffered the effects of the allergy or the effects of antihistamines, which I hate. I cannot stand the mental effects of those drugs, even the new ones that are supposed to be non-sedating. And when I moved out west, I had for several years tried desensitization shots, which were expensive and annoying and did nothing, and I almost died of an anaphylactic reaction to one of them on one occasion. And in retrospect, did nothing for the allergies. When I moved out west, the allergies disappeared, which is typical when you move to another location. But in 3 years, they came back. We have several species of ragweed in Arizona. They bloom at slightly different times than the ones that I was used to in the East, but it came back. But at that point in my life, this was in my mid-30s, late 30s, I had begun to change my diet, the way I eat. I became less reactive generally. I had grown up being very allergic as a kid to all sorts of things. I used to get hives and so forth, and all that began to drop away. And then I discovered stinging nettles, freeze-dried stinging nettle leaves, which work miraculously to make the symptoms of hay fever go away. It's a symptomatic treatment. You know, it lasts for a few hours. You have to repeat it, but it's completely non-toxic. But here's what is most interesting. In all the years that I had relied on suppressive medication, on antihistamines, the allergies persisted and, if anything, got worse. When I started using stinging nettles, after 2 years of only using that, the allergies disappeared. And I can't be more pleased with that. And I've given stinging nettles to, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of people and recommended it to many, many more. Just a wonderful example of the power of a natural remedy to work and work better than anything that we have in the pharmaceutical repertory. Another deep root of my medical philosophy is a lifelong interest in the mind and how the mind interacts with the body. And this was another subject area that I really learned nothing about in my conventional medical training. You know, that the mind was not taken seriously in medicine. And the idea that, the great limitation that we have in Western science and Western medicine is the domination of the materialistic paradigm. Materialistic philosophy says that all that is real is that which can be seen, touched, measured. And if you observe a change in a physical system, the cause has to be physical. Materialist philosophy does not allow for non-physical causation of physical events. And that's why we've been unable to take seriously placebo responses, mind cures, that whole realm. My interest in mind-body interactions eventually led me to take a course in medical hypnosis at Columbia University after I'd finished my basic medical training. It's one of the most interesting courses I ever took. And as a result of that, I frequently refer patients to mind-body practitioners, to hypnotherapists, guided imagery practitioners, a whole range of things. And I find that to be an enormously useful area of therapy that is consistently neglected in conventional medicine. And I thought I would just tell you one story from my one patient history to illustrate the subtleties of how the mind and body can interact. This is a long time ago now when I was first seeing patients in Arizona. A woman came to me who I think she was about 50. She was the wife of a professor of biochemistry at the University of Arizona. And she was a very sophisticated, intelligent woman who was from New York. She had been through a lot of psychoanalysis, a lot of insight into herself. She looked well. She sat down, looked at me, and she said, "I have Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia. This is a very rare disease that I had read about once to study for a medical exam, never seen in the flesh. It's a cancer of the bone marrow that's related to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and multiple myeloma, in which one type of immune cell, plasma cells, begin to proliferate malignantly, and these cells produce antibodies. They produce proteins which are useless, non-functional, called macroglobulins. And an immediate problem is that the accumulation of these in the blood make the blood too thick. So often the presenting symptoms are clotting or bleeding because these cells crowd out the normal cells in the bone marrow, so they don't make enough red cells and so forth. It's an incurable disease. There are treatments. The main treatment that she was having was every few weeks she had plasma drawn off to remove these proteins and thin the blood so she'd avoid the clotting problems. But she'd had this disease, she said, for something like 12 years, which is not common. I mean, often this disease has a rather short course. It can turn, become much more aggressive. And usually you don't see somebody that has this for 12 years and looks well like this. So I asked her, more and more questions about it, and something didn't add up about the fact that she looked so well and that this had just been going on for so long. And I said to her, "Are you sure that you have Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia?" She said, "Oh yes, I was diagnosed by Dr. Waldenstrom himself." Dr. Waldenstrom was a Swedish scientist. So that was the end of our interview. And the next time I saw her, I said, "How did you happen to be diagnosed by Dr. Waldenstrom?" She said, "Well, my husband was one of 5 people in the world studying macroglobulins. So Dr. Waldenstrom had come over to work with him." And so I thought about this. I said, "Was this before or after you got the disease?" And she said, "Oh, it was before." So I went home that night and I was lying in bed and thinking about how improbable this is. So I called her back in and I said, "What do you make of the fact, that your husband is one of 5 people in the world studying this disease and you get the disease?" And she said, "Well, the first thing I thought was, might he have brought it home from the laboratory?" So she asked him, and he said, "No, there's no evidence that this is infectious in any way." And I said to her, "Well, could he have brought the idea of it home from the laboratory?" And she sort of looked off into space. Well, over the time that we saw each other, we got to be friends, and she wanted me to come to her home and have dinner and meet her husband. The husband was a native of Hungary, very old world, very materialistic, thought everything to do with alternative medicine was nonsense, and in particular thought that the idea that the mind can influence the body was ridiculous. So from the moment we met, I had the feeling we should be on our best behavior with each other. So we tiptoed very carefully around the issues. But as I sat with them, it was so clear to me, my intuitive sense, that somehow the origin of her disease and the course of it had something to do with their relationship. And I was reluctant to probe too deeply, but it turned out that at the time that Dr. Waldenstrom had come over, he was having an affair. She really thought she was losing him. And it just seemed so clear to me that by getting his disease, this was her way of holding on to him. And at the same time, she had protected herself from the usual course of this disease. I mean, I can't prove that. This is just a gut feeling that I have. But to me, this is just, I could give you example after example of this kind of thing that I see all the time, that it just to me suggests the incredible subtleties and complexities and intricacies in which mind and body are intertwined. And this is a dimension of health and illness that is completely slighted in conventional medicine, and one that you can only really get a feel for if you have time to sit with people and get to know them. There's a famous adage that it's more important to know what kind of patient has the disease than what kind of disease the patient has. And I very firmly believe that. And so there's no substitute for being able to sit with a person and get a sense of who they are and what their makeup is, what their belief structure is, among other things, so that you can present treatments to them in ways that will interact very productively with their own belief system. Now, when I finished my basic clinical training, I decided I didn't want to go on with the kind of medicine that I had been taught. And I made that decision for two reasons. The first was that I felt if I got sick, I wouldn't want done to me what I had been taught to do to other people. But I didn't know what to do in its place. I also felt that I had learned nothing about how to keep people healthy. And it's always seemed to me that the main business of doctors should be to teach people how not to get sick in the first place. And I had learned nothing about that. Also, I felt that what I had been taught to do did too much harm. And the biggest category of harm was adverse drug reactions. I have a new book called Mind Over Meds. Subtitle is Protect Yourself from Over-Medication by Knowing When Drugs Are Necessary, When Alternatives Are Better, and When to Let the Body Heal on its own. I consider over-medication to be the biggest black mark on conventional medicine today. If you're not familiar with all these statistics, you should be. Adverse drug reactions are now the fourth leading cause of death in this country. In the hospitalized population alone, it's estimated there's something like 400,000 deaths a year directly due to medication. And this is not errors. It's the right drug given to the right patient for the right indication and the right dose, and 400,000 people a year die. That is not acceptable. And often it is, it would be funny if it were not so sad to see all these articles that come out damning dietary supplements and herbal remedies, that these are dangerous. The Wall Street Journal had a front page article 2 years ago saying taking a multivitamin will kill you, based on really, really sloppy research and enormously exaggerated fears generated from that. The numbers of people who die from herbal remedies a year, you can probably count on the fingers of one hand, and those are always mistakes. That's where some poisonous plant has been mistakenly picked, packaged, labeled as a useful plant. So there's day and night comparison there. The escalation of use of medications, not just prescription drugs, but also over-the-counter drugs, as well as the whole range of natural remedies, dietary supplements. It's astonishing how many things people are taking. The statistics that I've been able to find are that when I was growing up in the late 1940s, 1950s, Americans took prescribed medication at about 10% of the rate that they do now. So something has happened in that time. One of the things that's happened is direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceuticals. A noxious practice. There's only one other country in the world that allows that, New Zealand. I don't even remember how that got in. It got in during the Clinton administration. I don't remember any debate about it. Whenever I talk to audiences, and I'll tell you this too, write your legislators and urge an end to that. I mean, this is something that should be stopped. It has been a boon to pharmaceutical companies and a disaster for medical practice. And I have to tell you that I have a very dim view of most of the stuff that you see advertised on television. I think the manufacturers enormously exaggerate the benefits of these drugs and enormously downplay their risks, often with the collusion of medical journals. That's a story yet to come out. So what I did in this book was identify what I thought were the 10, 12 categories of medications that I think are most commonly overused and misused, and then write about what people really need to know about these drugs, what their benefits are, what their risks are. In each chapter, I give detailed information about the integrative medicine management of the conditions for which these medications are being used. And an integrative treatment plan might include appropriate use of medication, but when you do use such medication, you want to use the lowest dose, start with the lowest dose of the least potent medication, and then you're doing other methods as well. And all of these begin with lifestyle modification. One of the complaints I have about the way we test drugs today is that we do randomized controlled trials in which drugs are tested against placebos. They're never tested against lifestyle modifications, which would be really interesting to know. What is the efficacy of lifestyle modification, dietary change, modification of physical activity, stress reduction? How would that stack up against the efficacy of a pharmaceutical drug, for example? We don't get that information. So some of the categories that I've looked at are antibiotics. I think this is one that's come to public attention about the problems of overuse of them. Statins, the medications for GERD, especially the PPIs, proton pump inhibitors, antihistamines, medications for the common cold and the flu, psychiatric medications for kids and for adults. By the way, with psychiatric medications for children, I think this is absolutely alarming to me. I would say the big concern here should be that we know absolutely nothing about how these medications affect the developing brain. So we are doing a vast experiment with our children, and really nobody knows what these results will be. And I am just horrified at some of the practices I see out there. There's another famous adage in medicine that a new remedy should be used as much as possible while it still has the power to heal. And that is a very apt description of what happens with the history of medications. Medications work best near the time of their introduction, and their efficacy seems to fade over time. Why? My way of interpreting that is that there's great belief in the power of new things. So new medications are more likely to generate mind-mediated effects, placebo responses. I'm all for placebo responses. You don't want to figure out how to make them happen more of the time. They are pure healing responses from within that are mediated by the mind. But over time, that belief in novelty fades and it leaves the drug standing on its own, which may not look very impressive. The SSRI antidepressants are a great case in point. When these were first introduced, Prozac, Zoloft, all of them, they were hailed as, the greatest thing to come along in a long time in the pharmaceutical world. Everybody was put on them. People said, these were fantastic. There was a lot of randomized controlled trials supporting their use. Over time, after 10 years, 15 years, the research got fuzzier. It became harder to distinguish the effects of these drugs from the effects of placebos. And the people who were strongly in support of them said, well, maybe that's true in cases of mild depression, but for moderate, severe depression, clearly these drugs work. Then we began looking more carefully at that, and it became harder even in moderate depression to distinguish placebo responses from the effects of these drugs. So then people said, well, that may be true, but for severe depression, now even in severe depression, it's not so easy to distinguish these from placebos, and it may be that it's only in very, very severe depression that you can justify the effects of these drugs. So a response of the people who are in favor of psychiatric medication has been now to add other drugs to these to make them work better. And the drugs that they add are antipsychotic drugs, a group called second-generation antipsychotic drugs. Now, when I first learned about antipsychotic drugs, these are drugs that were developed for schizophrenia, for major mental illness. They're not things to be given out casually for depression. But commonly now, people with depression are started immediately on both an SSRI and an antipsychotic drug. And there are even ads on television telling you if your antidepressant isn't working so well, ask your doctor to prescribe one of these antipsychotic drugs. I mean, that just is horrifying to me. And this is being done in lots of children today. Another category I looked at are drugs for ADHD, which I think, is vastly overdiagnosed condition. There is a subset of kids that really have this, for whom medication may be useful, but the numbers of people put on stimulant medication, very alarming. I also look at steroids, at non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. There's a chapter on over-medication of children, and a chapter which I think is, very important on over-medication of the elderly. And in each chapter I also give case histories. But this, as I say, this is a big black mark against conventional medicine today. And one of the main motivations that I wanted to develop other methods of managing common health conditions. By the way, I also asked a pharmacist to write a chapter in this book, because I've always believed that pharmacists should be the people who can advise both patients and doctors about proper uses of medications, as well as their interactions with each other and interactions with over-the-counter drugs and with dietary supplements and herbal remedies. The problem is that pharmacists are not well trained in that last area. So it's important to get their curriculum up to speed so that they're knowledgeable about, can give people useful advice about dietary supplements and herbal remedies. So as I said, I didn't know what to do in place of the medicine I'd learned. I wanted to do something else, so I dropped out of medicine for a number of years, made my living as a writer, found ways to travel around the world and look at healing practices in other cultures. I spent a lot of time in South America, looking at shamans in this country, working with chiropractors and osteopathic physicians and naturopathic physicians, Chinese practitioners of Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, and so forth. And gradually, out of all this, I put together my own system. But interestingly, in all these years of running around, it turned out that the person who I had most to learn from was right in my backyard in Tucson, Arizona, and had been there all the time. I didn't know about him. He was an elderly osteopathic physician. I've written about him, Dr. Robert Fulford. When I met him, he was in his 80s. He was a master of cranial therapy. He was an old-time osteopath who just did hands-on manipulation, used no medication. He was a great believer in the healing power of nature. He said, he didn't talk that much, you'd have to draw him out, but he'd say, you just have to make these adjustments and let old Mother Nature do her work. By the way, there's another I like collecting famous sayings in medicine. There's another one that the main business of a doctor should be to distract the patient while time cures the problem. Anyway, he provided very nice distraction. It was wonderful to have his hands on you. He did very gentle sorts of manipulation. One of the things that I saw him do quite regularly was end recurrent cycles of ear infections in kids. And he would do this with one session of manipulation, mostly designed to improve breathing. And often after he worked on, you could see the kid's chest expand much more fully. And his idea was that respiration is the mechanical force that pumps lymphatic fluid. And that if breathing is not full, if breathing is restricted, that there's stagnant fluid that accumulates in the middle ear, which provides a breeding ground for bacteria. And he said you could wipe the bacteria out with antibiotics all you want, but if you didn't deal with that root problem, the infection would come back, which is what we usually see. There are endless cycles of antibiotics, and kids keep getting ear infections. He would do one treatment, they'd never get another ear infection. I tried for about 2 years to get one pediatrician in Tucson to come to his office and watch this, and nobody would come. And to me, that's one of the saddest things, that people who consider themselves scientific won't even look at something that does not fit their belief system. How can you be a scientist if you're not willing to just look and observe? I finally did get someone to come down and send patients to him and filmed a little documentary of him. But, he strongly reinforced my intuitive sense that the human organism is incredibly resilient, has amazing capacity to maintain itself, to repair, tissue to regenerate, to adapt to injury and loss. And I must say, I find that to be the most important function that I often perform for patients, is simply being able to tell them genuinely and with confidence that they can get better. That most people that I meet do not have confidence in the body's intrinsic power of healing. And I think to be able to operate from that belief is very powerful today. And that is the fundamental principle of integrative medicine. That is to restore the emphasis, the focus of medicine on the intrinsic healing ability of the human organism. So as a result of my experiences, my intuitive beliefs, working with Dr. Fulford and other people, I gradually, I began writing about my philosophy of medicine. I called what I was developing natural and preventive medicine. I came to use the term integrative medicine later. I never really expected to be seeing patients, to be practicing full time, but patients began showing up at my doorstep. And it was not a very easy doorstep to get to. I lived over a really bad, rough road in a canyon outside of Tucson, and nonetheless, patients would show up. And at first, I was a little reluctant to practice because I didn't know what I was good at. And I gradually found that I was good at two things. I'm very good at diagnosis, and I do that mostly by listening to people. I had teachers, and I have read in books that if you ask the right questions, patients will make the diagnosis for you in their own words. And I have absolutely found that to be true. But that assumes that you know how to ask questions, that you know how to listen, and you have time to do that. And unfortunately today, not only are many health professionals not trained to do that, but they don't have time to do it because the healthcare system doesn't allow for it. And I also found that I was good at being what I call a therapeutic marriage broker. I know how to arrange happy alliances between patients and practitioners. I know who goes with whom, whether that's within conventional medicine or outside of it. And as I say, I gradually came to call what I was doing integrative medicine. For a long time, I'd say 15 years, I got a larger and larger following in the general public, but none of my medical colleagues paid any attention to what I was saying. None. There was a period in the 70s when we had a holistic health movement in this country. There were holistic health clubs. It was one that started in Tucson. There was one doctor who was the doctor from the Student Health Services at the university who came. Otherwise, not one physician ever came to any of the events. It was nurses, psychologists, social workers, patient activists, no physicians. And that did not change until the early 1990s. And what happened then? That was when the economics of healthcare began to go south. And for me, a very interesting lesson has been that no amount of ideological argument moved anything. It was only when the pocketbooks of institutions began to be squeezed that they began to open to what patients had been asking for. And about that time, this is 1993, my best friend from Harvard Medical School, a cardiologist, was named chief of medicine at the University of Arizona. He came with a new dean. They both came from the University of Massachusetts. The new dean, Jim Dolan, also a cardiologist, had been a psychology major as an undergraduate, which is unusual. And the two of them had been instrumental in getting John Kabat-Zinn's program in mindfulness-based stress reduction started at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. And my friend Joe Alpert said, well, now that you have friends in high places, what do you want to do? And I said, I'd like to change all of medicine. He said, how do you want to do that? I said, well, I'd like to try to offer a residency in a field that I want to call integrative medicine. He said, let's talk to the dean. The dean said, you can't start a residency in a field that doesn't exist. So he said, back up a step and think about creating a fellowship for physicians who'd completed residency training. He said, that way you won't be accused of tampering with unformed minds. And he gave me the go-ahead to try to design such a fellowship. So I had no money. I had one friend, not a doctor, a friend of mine, a woman that I'd known for some time in Tucson, who was in education. We were given basically a broom closet in a trailer in the parking lot behind the university hospital with a phone. And from that little office, we organized first a think tank that took place over a weekend at Canyon Ranch in Tucson, in which we brought together, I think, about 15 people from various fields to hammer out the beginnings of a curriculum in a fellowship in integrative medicine. And then we advertised, and we got 4 doctors who were willing to come to Tucson for 2 years and study, which is a risk that they took. So for a number of years, we began training 4 doctors a year in a 2-year intensive program in all of the subjects that are not taught in conventional medical schools, starting with nutrition, which to me has always been foundational and which I learned almost nothing about in my medical training. And this has grown now into a very large, robust program. We now teach mostly online. We've graduated over 1,600 physicians and nurse practitioners and physician's assistants from this 2-year fellowship. We also have programs in 62 residencies across the country. We train medical students. We have programs for allied health professionals that all of you are eligible to take. It's a major educational thing, good thing. And there are now textbooks of integrative medicine. Oxford University Press publishes a series that I'm the general editor of for clinicians. I think we've got about 15 titles out there now in different medical specialties. Every journal you pick up has references to integrative medicine. It is becoming a mainstream phenomenon. Now, I have to tell you that I think that one of the basic principles of integrative medicine, first, is the emphasis on the intrinsic healing potential of the human organism. Second, the importance of lifestyle and understanding lifestyle choices. I said nutrition was something that was completely absent from my medical education. This is a core subject area. And I have just seen so many fads in nutrition come and go. We've lived through an era in which fat was demonized as the ultimate bad thing, then carbohydrates, then wheat, then sugar. It's a lot of craziness out there. Some years ago, really became interested in the idea that chronic low-level inflammation is the root cause of chronic serious diseases that kill and disable people prematurely, and that therefore keeping inflammation in check is your best shot at overall longevity and health. The mainstream diet in this country is strongly pro-inflammatory. It gives us the wrong fats, the wrong carbohydrates, not enough of the protective elements that are mostly found in herbs and spices. So I developed an anti-inflammatory diet, an anti-inflammatory pyramid that I think you're familiar with. I used the Mediterranean diet as a template and tweaked it by adding Asian influences like mushrooms and spices like ginger and turmeric and green tea to make it more powerful at containing inappropriate inflammation. And this is the nutritional philosophy that I operated from. The first step of the first of all, it should be the anti-inflammatory lifestyle. Diets by definition are things we go off of, and that's not what I mean. But the basic first step is to avoid eating refined, processed, and manufactured food. That's simple. And if we were to take one step in this country to improve, to get us out of the nutritional mess that we're in, I would say if we could get people to stop drinking sweet liquids, that would put us so far ahead of the curve. And it's not just soda, it's also fruit juice, it's energy drinks, it's putting sugar in coffee and tea, all of it. If people would just stop drinking sweet liquids, if we could focus on that, we would be in much better shape than we are today. So I have hope there. One of the, I don't know whether any of you have eaten at a True Food Kitchen restaurant. We just opened our 17th a few days ago in Naples, Florida, and we have plans to open 20 more in the next few years. This has been great fun for me. I'm a very good home cook. I love to cook. I love food. Over the years, people said, you ought to open a restaurant. I was never tempted to do that because I was smart enough to know I knew nothing about the restaurant business, and it looked like a very tough business. But I was introduced to a very successful restaurateur in Arizona. About 9 years ago, I suggested to him that it'd be great if there were a restaurant that served food that was both healthy and delicious. He said, health food doesn't sell. He thought I meant tofu and sprouts. I cooked for him and his wife. He liked the food. He said he was willing to give it a try, but he was very skeptical. And we opened the first one I think 8 years ago now in Phoenix. From the moment it opened, just as the economy tanked and everyone said we were crazy, from the moment it opened, it was successful, as all the other ones have been. He continued to be skeptical for about 6 months, and then finally conceded that he'd never seen anything like this. He said he'd never had people come up to him on the street and hug him for opening a restaurant, or beg him to have restaurants like this in Buffalo or in Kansas City and so forth. Anyway, it's been fun, it's been great success, and it's been especially satisfying to me to see people eating food that I love, and have made over the years. One of our signature dishes is a kale salad. I think we take some credit for the kale craze in this country. I was in Italy a few years before the restaurant opened, and in Tuscany, and I was served, a salad of raw kale. I would never have considered eating raw kale. I hated kale as a kid, and when I came to like it, older, I used to grow it in my garden, but I always ate it sautéed lightly. And then this was a revelation to me to taste kale. It was the black kale, lacinato kale, that had been allowed to marinate in lemon juice and salt, which takes the bitterness out and softens the leaves, changes the flavor and texture. And then you put olive oil and red pepper and garlic and so forth. So I introduced this to the restaurant. Wildly popular. At one point, we were responsible for a total dearth of organic kale in California. We used it all up. But I remember one time being in the Phoenix restaurant, and a mother came up to me with 2 young kids, a boy and a girl, and she said, "Tell Dr. Weil what your favorite thing to eat is." And the girl, who was younger, sort of hid behind the mother, and the boy said, "Kale salad, kale salad." I mean, who would have ever thought that kids would be eating kale salad? This is great. Now, I have to, as a final pitch to you, health professionals today, whatever healthcare is going to look like in the future, and I can't predict what it will look like. I can give you some ideas. I think that, nobody can pay the bills for high-tech medicine anymore. I think it is very possible that conventional allopathic medicine will become a specialty that will only be able to be practiced in large urban medical centers that can afford all the hardware. And a lot of smaller and community hospitals just aren't going to be there anymore. And I would love to see new kinds of institutions come into being. I've always envisioned healing centers that would be hybrids between spas and clinics, not spas in the sense of, places that are only available to the affluent and focused on physical stuff and pampering, but spas more in the European tradition of being restorative places. And these would be not for terminal care or critical care, but you could go there if you were well, to have lifestyle examined. You could go there for help with managing routine complaints, headaches, back pain, GI complaints, allergies, and what would be offered there would be integrative treatment, where there would be teams of healthcare professionals of different training who would coordinate care. In addition, there would be lifestyle coaching, that you would come out knowing more than you went in about how to live. And that might include learning about how to cook, how to grow some of your own food, how to handle stress better. And that stays in these places would be reimbursed in whole or in part by insurance. I see a huge role for health coaches in healthcare of the future. As I said, that a major cornerstone of integrative medicine is lifestyle medicine. And that means being able to ask the right questions, to analyze people's lifestyle choices, help them to make better choices, to figure out what's preventing them from making better choices. I think an important part of this is that you yourself as a practitioner have to exemplify healthy living, that you model healthy living for patients. That's the best way to inspire them. But the fact is today that most health professionals, certainly most physicians, don't have time to do this. That even if they wanted to, they don't have time to ask questions about lifestyle and to give people the advice that they need. And health coaches do. So you are being trained in in a system that I think is going to be critically important in coming years. And I just see a tremendous future for health coaching. So, congratulations on having chosen this path. I think that I congratulate IIN for, having really taken this to the next level.